It's a dark winter's night in Bavaria, and it's a wintry afternoon in Vermont. I'm here with Zak Stein. It's really good to have you on, Zak.
It's good to be back, man. Thank you.
Zak, you are very well respected in matters of deep sense making around this time, and somebody that I know a lot of my good friends are always very excited to hear your reflections and inquiries into the multi-layered cake of this time, which hopefully we're going to slice into today. So, yeah, researching for this, I came across this awesome paper you wrote with Mark Gaffney on the apocalypse of the modern world system and the possibility of the democratization of enlightenment as a sort of way through the eye of the needle of this moment, this historical time. So I thought that could sort of be the arc that we might move through today. And maybe in the first half, we can focus in on what is going on in the collective psyche right now. What is the nature of this apocalypse? And then potentially move into what are the spaces, what are the openings of possibility, what does the democratization of enlightenment potentially look like?
Cool. It's a great place to dive in. Absolutely. That paper was, I think, like 2015 or something, 2016. It was a while ago. Gaffney and I put that out. But the trends we were seeing there and the kind of solutions we're laying out are absolutely still relevant. So I can go in any number of directions. So I'm curious which kind of how to begin.
Yeah, it's, as I said, it's multi-layered, and I've seen you speak to different layers of it. And you had that piece, "The War Broke Out in Heaven," sort of almost 2 years ago now, I think, at the beginning of COVID time. You've also spoken to the sort of schizophrenia that is being induced in the collective psyche by the unprecedented bombardment of image. Your recent work with Consilience Project speaks to the information war, that our collective understanding is sort of nested in an information landscape that's at war.
Right.
And then with that, we have a psychodrama playing out, I think, and that's, maybe we can delve into that a bit further. But maybe you could just sort of set the scene.
Yeah, I mean, to set the scene, it's, as I said, back in 2015, when I was finishing my second book, there was a sense already that something like existential risk or civilizational collapse, a kind of terminal vision, a kind of end vision for kind of this operating system, this civilizational epoch, was in the air. And then as we move closer to date, you get Jordan Hall writing on Medium about the war on sense making, and then Schmachtenberger on Rebel Wisdom, also war on sense making. And there was a sense of like how distorted and coercive the informational environment had become, and how fourth and fifth generational warfare, if I can speak very broadly to the Consilience work on informational warfare, fourth and fifth generational warfare was now worldwide and massively impactful, which is to say that we were in something like the beginnings of a third world war that was an information war before the pandemic began, and we were all aware of that. Or at least by we, I mean presumably your buddies who are like into my work. It's like, okay, this is what was happening. Like we were already kind of epistemologically out to sea. You know, I write in that essay for that recent Perspectiva book, Dispatches from a Time Between Worlds. This was written before COVID hit, about the 2016 presidential campaign, Clinton versus Trump, when the first instances of informational weapons of mass destruction were kind of used, that would kind of drop the quote unquote atom bomb of information, which looks a little bit like Cambridge Analytica and a whole bunch of stuff that had already been in play for a while. And then what's interesting is that when the pandemic unfolded, it unfolded into that pre-existing pathological informational environment. Right? And so one way to think about enlightenment, and it's actually the way enlightenment, like in that strict religious sense, that's the way Gaffney and I speak about it in that paper, is as sanity, just full stop. But like it's like an underlying theme. It's not mind-blowing psychedelic experience, although that can happen. And it's not some kind of like channeling the full intelligence of God or something like that, but that happens supposedly in the hagiographies and sutras and things of that nature. But a simple definition, I think that one that works is something like sanity, which has to do with your relationship with reality. And so we're already in a tenuous relationship with reality. And then you have to think, okay, when the pandemic occurred, did the informational environment get better or worse? And I think the argument has to be that it got worse, right? And so then I'm looking around as this thing unfolds, and especially as the lockdowns deepen and vaccination mandates and other things begin to roll out. And I start looking around and realizing that like, we must have, meaning we, like that smaller we, did we forget that it was so distorted? You know what I mean? And so there's been a stress-induced regression to simplistic adoptions of media narrative in the context of the pandemic amongst people who previously were well aware of just how distorted and disinformation induced and the whole thing is. And so what it looks like is that increasing certainty that comes with psychosis. So this is where we're weaving the strands together. People who are aware of what it looks like to be in kind of florid psychosis, even forms of deep paranoia, even certain forms of neurosis come with a kind of pathological certainty. You're really sure that the government is surveilling you. Like, and every license plate has a number on it that has some significance to you, right? You're just positive about that. Like you're certain about that. That over-determined certainty on emotionally and identity important items is one of those signs, right, of insanity. And so what I'm doing is like setting the scene of a widespread kind of deep pathology. And again, I'm not pointing fingers at individuals. Like I'm not saying that, although there is, I think, low-grade ubiquitous psychopathology in individuals across the way. I'm saying something more like that. The culture itself has gotten quite sick. And what that means for a culture is that it is losing touch with reality and forming dogmatic certainties and scapegoat and polarization dynamics as a result of those certainties, which is what you see when you study civilizational collapse as an educator and a psychologist across the board. You see, and also just when you study individual identity collapse, which is to say when you study deep forms of psychopathology, similar patterns occur. And so that is, that's the concern of where I'm at, which is why I started to do that research on propaganda with the Consilience paper, because there's things that occur in those environments where you can start to kind of try to tease apart those signifiers and those that like semiotic soup kind of like get out of the psychotic break by pointing back to reality when possible, which can sometimes mean pointing out the distortions very clearly of what's occurring. So it's a little bit of what I'm thinking these days. Yeah.
Just to try and sort of reflect back some of what I heard there. So it seems like a key point is that the huge fragmentation and the move into kind of multipolar informational warfare. So you're not saying one side is engaging in information warfare. It's that a kind of warfare of information, a manipulation of information towards strategic goals is coming from all different sides, states, parties, individuals, all towards different ends. And it's in that context that we then get the pandemic. And suddenly there's this move to like almost a top-down coherence that's coordinated between the states and the controllers of social media and the consensus as it's being manufactured and drawn out of scientific process is then being sort of imposed as a coherent dogma. How is that resonating?
I mean, but
it's actually a fragmented landscape.
It's pretty close. Yeah. I mean, what you have is, the multipolar information war. That's the first thing they get. Like one of the signs that you're captured in the information war is if you believe that the information you are getting access to somehow isn't part of that, and that it's only the bad guys who are engaging in propaganda and disinformation. Like, if you can say, hey, even the side that I agree with actually is involved in corrupt disinformation campaigns, but I still am with this side, but they are involved in corrupt disinformation campaigns, then you're a little bit more realistic. And then there's a different stance, which we can talk about, which we talked about last time we spoke about this kind of metaparadigmatic consciousness, a kind of transperspectival and communicative and conciliatory approach. That's another matter. I mean, so that's the first thing. It's multipolar, which means that it's not just one side spewing out disinformation. It's all sides strategically spewing out disinformation. And so we have to come to terms with that. And then that notion that there's this kind of strange recurrence or reversion back to non-decentralized kind of pre-digital broadcast modality of propaganda, which is to say we're going to have one story here that everybody buys, which is not what the internet's about. The internet is not, the digital made that obsolete. This whole one story everybody goes by thing. And then that escalated into the information wars. So this was a lot to do with digital lowering the barriers of access into effective large-scale propaganda, right? So that's one of the things I write about with Consilience. But in any case, the pandemic, because of the intensity of the situation, the stress, the kind of warlike atmosphere, many people in their bodies and then many organizations were ready to kind of revert to attempt to do a centralized propaganda campaign, kind of old school, as if we were all watching the same television channels and couldn't watch anything else. And then and it resulted, because we're not in that situation. We have a digital decentralized information environment. There was a kickback. You had inevitable counter expert discourses emerge, which tied into that pre-existing kind of polycentric kind of information war, right? And then I was noting more specifically, just to like deepen your reflection, and I was noting also that individuals themselves under stress were reverting to simplistic ways of understanding the information environment again. Even though before the pandemic, many of them were able to perceive the informational environment with more complexity and nuance. So I've seen that very directly. It's not clear exactly how that plays out, but it's one of the dynamics of widespread attempts at large scale propaganda, is that you start to get forms of kind of a coercive patterning of speech and behavior. And so that has begun to occur as well, which is the most disconcerting thing, I think, in the whole situation, is that element of a kind of reverting back to and actually desiring for that one narrative. Like many people who would never think of themselves as being book burning, censoring, kind of like canceling types, let alone those people who are already that type, which is another conversation. Many people who are now in those ranks on certain issues. And so that's just, I think, worth noting. The situation's gotten worse. The information war has gotten worse because there's more people convinced that their side is right, rather than being convinced that we're not actually in a position to start talking about who's right and wrong, because we're actually not even speaking to one another, because no one's engaging in good faith. So if you think your side has won the argument and is right, then you're probably pretty deeply captured. If you're aware that actually my side included is not engaging in good faith, first of all, if you're on a side. And so there's all of these dimensions where I'm seeing what, like, as a reflective psychological practitioner and then studied in propaganda, you just start to see it. These are what I've been calling the genocidal grammar, or the thought terminating cliches that allow us to form tribes that hate one another with dogmatic certainties about our beliefs. And that's not what the fourth estate should foster in a democracy. And it's not what any reasonable civic infrastructure would foster in a digital age. And so this is just very clear that deeper problem, even than the pandemic, is the distortion of the information environment and the co-opting of the civic and educational infrastructures by a small number of technologists.
Yeah, that's really good. And I'm feeling like a good pivot point here, especially as you sort of draw out, there is this psychological underlayer. And that, like, the way you're describing it, for me, evokes like a toxic relationship. And I think there's something very fruitful for me when talking about collective psyche, a collective psychological process, that it kind of mirrors individual process. And so in the context of COVID as the apocalypse, or this time as a kind of apocalypse, and you've spoken to apocalypse as a kind of revealing of things. Part of what I've observed in my own journey of lots of other people I've seen around, is that COVID was kind of the moment that catalyzed confrontation with long-standing emotional trauma, developmental arcs was sort of thrown into a crucible by the degree of instability at this time. And part of what I've come to understand in that inquiry is that the telos of trauma is to draw out, like, unconscious material wants to draw out it wants to draw forth its reenactment so that it can be resolved and made conscious. And so this is the individual process that I've observed a lot, but I think it's also happening collectively, perhaps on some level. And you can see in Germany and Austria, there's a unique way in which the historical trauma is sort of being re-presenced, and like the sense of the possibility of that kind of collective sociopathy is being re-presenced and having to be re-confronted. And for a lot of the majority here, it's something that was sort of the other group, or like over there. And for others, you're sort of on the receiving end of it, and your sense making is leading you into a place where you have suddenly become the scapegoat. So yeah, and we've seen in Australia they're sort of coming to terms with their own. It's like drawing up this stuff about the genocide against the indigenous people there. Um, so what do you make of that sense that this uh, the intensity, the psychological intensity of COVID, of the meta crisis, of the sort of schizophrenic peak episode that is happening in the collective psyche, that is somehow drawing up the unconscious material of the past to undergo some sort of healing.
I mean, it's interesting train of thought. What came to mind was an Emerson quote, actually, which is that nature is the apocalypse of the mind, right? And so the apocalypse can be thought of as like a public end, right? It can be thought of as the end of everything for everyone. But a terminal vision of an individual life, which means an image of the ending of my life, is in that sense also apocalyptic for me. The judgment occurs, the ending of the mind, etc. And that notion that there are times in life, even though we're living, when we die to ourselves, and that we can be present to personal apocalypse and live through a kind of personal apocalypse, right? When you look at like Wallerstein's world systems theory and the multiple iterations of even the capitalist world system, you realize that there's the end of everything for everyone, but then there are these endings that occur in history and in life while we're living. And it is in those times that, yeah, the unveiling, the re-traumatization, but also the opening up of new possibilities to occur. And so you have to be careful looking at the individual to collective metaphor, as you're saying, the close analogy. But I do think, yeah, the notion of the apocalypse for the individual, which is to say the notion of identity death and identity rebirth. And in that process, the unveiling or the revealing of prior latent imagery, right? And intention. So I can see that. I'm not sure exactly what's happening at the collective level. As far as the kind of the opening that you're describing, I'm not sure. Because some of what is occurring is a side effect almost entirely of these lower order changes in infrastructure, specifically information infrastructure, but even lower order stuff like biomedical supply chains and stuff. So I don't know how much the cultural patterns we're seeing are the result of a kind of psychoactive reemergence of archetypal patterns from the past in our culture, and how much of them are psychological, basically pathological side effects of out of control infrastructure and distorted incentive systems, right? Like, so that's just my reflection, because I think it's too easy to reduce this to the kind of left-hand quadrants, if you will, in Wilbur's map. And I would actually say that a lot of what we're looking at here is not only the exhaustion of a way of life and of ideas, but the exhaustion of a paradigm of material and infrastructural organization. And I think that digital is bringing that like to a head. That if we don't figure out how to constrain innovation in digital technologies for things other than profit, then we're going to build tools that destroy our minds and addict us to disinformation, right? So this is the problem we've suffered with throughout the capitalist world system of complete misincentivizing innovation in the direction of profit. well, it's fine when the oil spills were thousands of miles away. But when the innovation becomes a psychotechnology that literally has the power to basically kind of almost brainwash you,
Mm.
uh, then the demand for our ability to be able to rein the power of technology for human good, that's like becomes extremely, extremely pressing.
Wow. I
Uh,
suppose there's a kind of meeting point there in that the shift in the informational landscape and the capacity to like construct this feedback reality based on these, profit driven metrics or whatever it is. There's a like more than ever before, or in a particular way, we're able to create our reality. Our reality is being created for us on some level. Like the sense for me is that we're living in a nightmare collectively, but we're also creating the nightmare. Like it's not that there's just an objective series of events. It's that there's this huge larger picture, which is how we have reacted, how we have created the conditions, like what has been the effect of these lockdowns and the possibility of more lockdown hanging over our heads. And that's what draws me to the sort of historical trauma of the First World War. If you think about like the shell shock, there's almost a way in which we're getting a digital shell shock of like hyper informational jarring content coming through, and there's a way in which these lockdowns really connect us with the Blitz and these different European experiences. Yeah.
mm. Yeah, I mean that it's worth just noting the differences between first, second, third, fourth, fifth generational warfare as the thing becomes increasingly informational and less kinetic, right? Which is to say, much of what we are experiencing, by we, I mean almost everyone in the West. And again, things look very different in Africa, incidentally, for example, and in India. But for the West, for Europe and the United States, Canada, we're looking at a form, we're like in a war, and most people don't realize that they're in a war. And so they wouldn't understand what you're saying. Shell shock's the analogy we should be using. I agree. We should be using war-like analogies to describe the psychological side effects of the informational environment. Uh, there has been some physical deprivations like lockdowns and maskings and other things, which will add to the effect. But the main effect has been screen-based information procurement at a rate that's just massively psychologically disorganizing. And that's information war. Constantly on the battlefield 24/7. A new story could drop at any minute, and it's like shells being dropped on you, and you get this little limbic system reaction, and then you see a counter story and you hate those people who give those stories, and you're in the mix of the information war constantly, but you don't realize it's a war. You think you're doing your duty as a citizen, remaining informed about public events, right? When in fact you're being addictedly drawn into a combative and coercive informational environment. And so that's I've been trying to like raise the alarm. Like, guys, like first of all, we need to protect the kids, because like in most wars, we don't send the kids out. I mean, when that happens, then you're in a bad war. But I mean, it happens. But the point is that in most wars, we try to protect the children first, and in particular. And so once you realize that it's a ubiquitous information war, not a fourth estate, and not an educational environment, then you try to protect the children. And then when you have to take precautions for yourself, right? In terms of realizing just how coercive and intentionally frightening and intentionally emotionally dysregulating and intentionally filling you with the language of non-thought, which is the thought terminating cliche or the genocidal grammars. This comes from the work of Robert Lifton, the psychiatrist who looked at survivors of Hiroshima and people who were in Maoist re-education camps. So knowing that when you when you go into social media environments and into even the large major news outlets like Fox, CNN, New York Times, wherever, with their websites and everything, that the affordances of those websites and how they interlock with Twitter and Facebook to form like an informational surround, that you're stepping into is something that you should understand more like a war zone, that it's a risky place to go. And it seems like, oh, I'm smart enough and tough enough to protect myself from the war zone. But that's true only if you really know that you're going into a war zone. So you have to take the metaphor seriously. And then there's all these things that follow from that, because it's an epistemological, spiritual, cultural war. It's not one of physical violence yet, or predominantly. And so that means that what is occurring when you take a hit is something like an epistemological subtraction from your like life meter. Like if you imagine like an epistemological life meter, like in a video game above your head, right? The question of how much of your relationship to reality can you sacrifice before it's too much, right? And you mentioned that feedback loop, and that between us, reality, and our informational intermediaries, right? And that's the Baudrillardian simulation, right? Baudrillard, the postmodernist, who had this theory, basically a theory of civilizational collapse, which is predicated upon deepening levels of simulation. With the success of civilization comes its ability to insulate itself in a simulation, the story that it tells about itself, similar to the way I insulate myself in a story that I tell about myself. And the whole idea is you build defense mechanisms to keep the stories you tell about yourself free from, distortion and being undermined. And then a good psychologist or a long relationship or good friends will be able to like get in there through the simulation you have of yourself and point to who you really are. But with civilizations, it's much more complex, but they have the same defense mechanisms that protect their simulations. And then those same dynamics of eventual disconnect from reality, to the point where reality will rear its ugly head one way or another. And again, nature being the apocalypse of the mind. This was not a bad virus in the world of viruses. We got lucky, you could argue, as this being the first global pandemic, right? And again, it's hard to even know the accuracy of what I'm saying there. Like, I'm aware that my understanding of what the coronavirus is, I had to work laboriously to extract from a completely distorted information environment, laboriously, which included speaking to experts who themselves were confused by the information environment. Rarely would I believe anyone who was certain about anything having to do with the virus, because how the hell could you be? The science is so novel and fresh, and the measures are so inconclusive, et cetera. So I got very worried when people started being very, very sure of themselves about what this thing was and the way to deal with it. But that's another, another story. The broader point I was making was that the ability of civilizations to embed their citizens in simulations of reality is known, documented, dangerous phenomenon. And so the question of, did the coronavirus bring us closer in touch with reality, or did the coronavirus bring us deeper into a simulation of reality, is an important question to ask. Because if we as a society have downgraded our capacity for learning about reality, then we're in a more dangerous situation. If we have upgraded our capacity for learning about reality as a whole, as a society, then that's actually called, I think, progress. Forgive me, in quotation marks, postmodern caveats everywhere. Progress would be the society's ability to improve its ability to learn about reality, not progress marked by executing certain standards of equity, or progress marked by executing certain moral things we believe in now. Progress marked by getting the society to learn better, about reality. That would be so that reality broadly construed, not reductive positivist material reality, the reality of our interiorities, the reality of culture, history, etc. So forgive me the kind of like diversion there, but I think it's important to get that my personal sense is that we've been driven deeper into a simulation of reality because the powers invested in so much of maintaining civilization have confronted something very, very complex. And so they're actually putting on an appearance. The question of how many people know that they're dealing and creating a simulation and how many people have no idea. I'm talking about people like Boris Johnson, right? Those who throw Christmas parties when others are in lockdown. Like, is that a symptom of their being really well aware that they're creating a simulation of reality for everybody else? Or is that just stupidity? I mean, so I'm just saying, but you can see how once you start to realize that there's this big difference between reality and what civilization presents to you as reality, then a whole bunch of stuff actually starts to become apparent. But
well, well, first of all, I just wanted to commend what you spoke to about actually making sense of COVID and how smoky that is. Like, that was a beautiful disclosure of academic integrous approach to this time. But what you've just spoken to, the kind of experience of gaslighting, or like it used to be that you sort of had to really look to the fringe to sort of find the instances where some sort of rule is being upheld for everybody, and then you step through a door and the rule is completely evaporated. You know, it's masks everywhere except for inside of the Senate, and then that kind of thing. But now it seems to be most of the population, I would say, like the average person is being subject to the imposition of a dogma, and then the underlying basis of the dogma changes. So they switch it out, and then a new rule is brought in. And there's something about this that actually seems to, like, the more you consent to the ground and the Overton window being changed and moved, the more you're sort of sinking into this this toxic dynamic where you don't have your own connection to what's real. So I wanted to introduce another thing from the paper, which was really cool to come across, Pierre Desjardins, and his idea, his almost prophetic expression of the directionality of the noosphere. As you guys put it, the noosphere, the sort of information, idea, cognitive layer of reality, was going to heat up as the world sort of converged in upon itself, as globalization occurred. It would be like more confrontation of more different understandings of reality. And that would heat up to some sort of precipice. And he spoke to the omega point as a sort of unforeseeable breakthrough opportunity that could occur in the context of that, a sort of profound collective awakening and emergence of Christ consciousness, something of that nature and magnitude. So, yeah, I would love to speak to that a little bit. And I also want to introduce a couple more pieces for the sort of last act of the dialogue. I mean, my feeling is that for me and for the young people, the people in my men emerging men group and friends who are sort of engaged in this sense making and in their own developmental spiritual journeys, they're in a kind of exodus where they've left a place of grounding in the reality that was handed to them, and now are in a sort of perpetual movement through the desert of the real, and occasionally coming together into this beautiful harmonic sense of making sense of this time and finding the musicality of that. So for me, dialogos, the practices of collective intelligence and transformative dialogue, are the kind of way in which we can, or one of the ways we can build little arcs through that exodus into this sort of chaotic time. So I wonder if you could speak to that. And I know you sometimes throw in the Hebrew metaphors and symbols. I'm very interested to hear more about that.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. So, yeah, so Teilhard, Desjardins, and the notion of the noosphere, which is, of course, classic. The notion actually comes from Teilhard Desjardins' collaboration with probably one of the greatest Russians who ever lived, Vladimir Verdansky, who first came up with the notion of the biosphere and the noosphere. And he spoke of consciousness, and specifically reason, as a geological force that operated on geological timescales. That you had the given geological forces that shaped the planet, and then from those emerged another geological force of the biosphere, which reshaped the rock itself. And then you had, of course, mind or consciousness, or what he called reason, which is a particular kind of higher order mind. I could speak to Henriquez about those different forms, but the point being that it's a geological force. And the most obvious evidence of this is urbanization, but then eventually for Verdansky and for Teilhard, the atomic bomb, which is literally the releasing of a cosmic force by reason in this weird little small biosphere. We release this like crazy cosmic force through our operating mind. So that notion that, the whole game changes when mind evolves on a rock in the middle. And then the more specific point was that the way this thing evolves, the way mind evolves, the way the noosphere evolves, because it's on a rock that's a sphere, as opposed to a flat plane, let's say, which Teilhard speculated about, you were inevitably running into one another. Like if we succeed, we will inevitably meet, that there will be an inevitable planetization of the human, just as there was an inevitable cerebralization or encephalization of the primate, right? And that's talking about the kind of trajectory towards complexity of consciousness in the nervous system as one of the telos of biological evolution. So then you get the telos of the noosphere towards this kind of closure of the human family in one networked consciousness, basically. And of course, that's related to the notion about geological force, which is at that point, we hold the whole planet in our hands, basically. Like we could destroy the whole thing if we wanted to. So there's some kind of fulcrum that occurs there, which has been noted by Teilhard, that there's but also by others, that this is a critical moment or a critical path, as Bucky Fuller would say, this moment of planetization, and specifically the telos of the noospheres, right? And so if you relate this conversation to our prior one about simulation versus reality, and you think, okay, does the planetary noosphere, when it reaches virtual closure, get in touch with reality and Christ consciousness floods the metaverse? Or is it the case that when this thing goes into virtual closure, we get a kind of strange dystopian, planetary, virtual, simulation-based, authoritarian kind of like lock-in that lasts for a very long time, because it's very hard to escape from, right? Which is interestingly, like that's one of the hypotheses Nick Bostrom, the great existential risk expert, postulates as a potential major catastrophic risk, is a kind of planetary totalitarianism as a result of that irresistible information-based simulation creation. So it's creepy, but that's like the Matrix metaphor, right? Interestingly enough, Baudrillard is the book that Neo opens in the opening scene of the Matrix to take the thing out of. That's a Baudrillard book. So this all kind of has to weave together. I think we probably spoke about that last time we were on. So there's some theme here that we keep revisiting. And so many people took the noosphere to mean the internet, basically, especially in the early days of the internet. There was a kind of a transhumanist techno utopianism that emerged from some readers of Teilhard. Now, interestingly enough, Verdansky was a member of the Russian cosmist movement. The Russian cosmists are fascinating. Not many futurists in the West know about the cosmists, but the cosmists have many of the main futurist ideas, including physical immortality and kind of like a cosmic colonization as destiny, and then also saving the sun from self-destruction and other things which concern transhumanists, but that don't really concern normal people. So the cosmists are worth checking out. But the point I was making was that the internet gets synonymized with the noosphere, and there was this kind of techno-utopianist hope that the internet would kind of like make the Teilhardian Christ consciousness a reality. This obviously has not happened. It was a misunderstanding, I believe. Yes, the digital has something to do with the interconnections necessary for the noosphere to like reach its evolutionary potential, but it's in the dynamics you're describing of actual communication between actual humans where the most powerful dynamics of consciousness exist. And so this is, I think, a very subtle point, but it's worth getting into, which is that there are ways of thinking about collective intelligence where you posit something like a superordinate kind of like quote being that could have a distinct identity from the group itself. And then there's another way to think about collective consciousness where it's a very complex, dynamical, embodied process, which basically requires the co-presence of people, and that there is there's nothing more ontologically significant than the people, right? If you're in the model where, okay, we all get together and it starts to work, right? And then all of a sudden there is a thing that we are now all beholden to, which is greater than us, right? I believe that phenomenologically that is the experience, but I believe the place to locate that thing is in each person, not in something that is greater than the people. There's a subtle distinction, but it's the difference between a kind of totalitarian reading of Hegel and kind of a liberating reading of Hegel, right? And other key thinkers who play at this matrix of like what comes next. Oh, it must be something that emerges through the human, something like what Christ was prophesizing and his early practitioners were doing, which was like this group process where all of a sudden there's more to any of us than we could be individually because we're being together in the presence of God, basically. I've seen that go wrong because I've seen it turn into basically a form of like a form of crypto totalitarianism, frankly, because an identity is the group comes to have an identity that's more important than the identity of any of the individual members, right? It's possible to have a group that has an identity that's co-equal with the identity of the individual members. And then it's possible to have a group that has no identity. And then it's not really a group. That's mostly what we struggle with. And so because we don't normally have groups with identities that we feel we belong to, and we don't know how to commit ourselves to something larger than ourselves, which is not actually something larger than ourselves, but is just the other people. This is the point I'm making. Then we end up flying all the way towards these, what I would call kind of old school groups, which basically, in kind of Hebrew terms, would be idolatry, right? Because you will have created something like a group identity or image or consciousness, which you then kind of worship and are willing to sacrifice yourself to, which is a lower order God than the God you're doing the practice in the presence of, right? So I don't have time to elaborate this, but you're bringing up this point, and I know the world that you're speaking to, the world of circling, the world of collective intelligence and emergent consciousness, and amazing things happen that are phenomenologically very hard to piece apart. And I've seen people phenomenologically switch into I believe, collapse of the individual into group consciousness, and specifically a form of ethical commitment that deprioritizes the individual in favor of some abstract representation of the group consciousness. And then there's another way of having that allegiance, but the allegiance is to concrete individuals who in themselves embody the ideals of the group. And so it's not a faceless commitment to an abstract ideal of the group. It's a embodied, concrete, unique commitment to you and you and you. Right. And that's very, very different, because if you have that, then I will never do something terrible to you in the interest of the group image. Right, or in the interest of the group consciousness that we supposedly created. I will always be looking at you and dealing with you. If you go the other way, then it's very easy for you to be just kind of a certain type in this subclass, all committed to this broader thing. And so now you become much more easy to strategically relate to in the interest of the greater good, right? And so that's like a subtle thing, and it's easier to demonstrate in practice with people when the phenomenological events begin to occur. But a lot of it's mixed in with the language too, and a tendency to over-ontologize the occurrences of those group practices.
Yeah, that's a really, really important juncture, or like thing to see the realm of possibility, because it seems to me that we are moving towards more of that kind of thing, more of these kinds of emergent group processes, gatherings. For me, it's about sort of containers that come together through a period of time and then dissolve. And, unique self symphonies, we have to inquire more into that as well. But it seems to me that potential is really essential to responding to what we've spoken about thus far. And you've really articulated this more in terms of an educational, the sort of revolution in education. Maybe that's the wrong word to use, but I want to posit that maybe this kind of dialogue practice, this transformative dialogue, however we're going to term it, becomes an integral part of that somehow, that it becomes part of the civic duty that allows you to lift up from that downward spiral that we seem to be in, where the fabric is literally just burning and flaking before our eyes, and to actually be able to revitalize it together.
Yeah, man. Yeah, totally. I agree. I mean, it's, I talk about the educational relationship as a species specific trait, like there's something very unique that the human does with the younger humans, taking a lot of time and care. And so there are still places, even today, in this mix, where you can find, especially parent-child or mother-child relationships, caregiver-child relationships. It's in those relationships where, by the grace of God, usually you still have the preservation of non-strategic communication, right? The preservation of non-simulated co-relation to reality and to the realities that we each represent, right? And so we have to take sanctuary in those places where we know that the warfare is not taking place. And then from there, begin to extrapolate out what it would look like to actually respect our interlocutors and to relate to people, even to people less informed than us, right? And this is speaking to the powers that be who run nudge campaigns, right? Like the idea would be that there are ways to establish sincere educational relationships of care that don't involve manipulation. So I think we just need to return to those sentiments of the hearth. I'm just noticing in the background of the hearth and of the home, and of the intimacy of non-strategic, good faith communication, which exists. We all know it, and in fact, the whole world runs on it, despite the fact that there's this overwhelming kind of colonization of those practices by the systemic imperatives that make coercion almost like an obligation to your shareholders. So yeah, that would be the thing that I would end on, which is that, and this is true for the circling and those things too. It's like, think about the relationships being created here. Many of them are so good. Many of them are so good. And the reason they're so good is because they have that taste of non-coercive communication. And so we need to get used to that. And then from that context, learn to establish relationships of teacherly authority and education, where there's an epistemic asymmetry, and yet there's still mutual respect, love, and a shared interest in both parties benefiting from the relationship. And so then from there, healthy teacherly authority, healthy educational relationships, then you can start to rebuild something like a larger civilization or a larger, project of reform. But absent those things, it becomes hard to talk to one another, which is the situation we're in now. So slowing down and working on that. But it's also just, like I said, it's not at this point completely about what we do with our minds and our mouths. Like, there are a whole bunch of complex, just material processes in play, which I mentioned before, these supply chains and digital technologies and economic realities that have their own path dependent evolution and development in the next 5-10 years, right? So that's why you can't just have conversations about conversation. You also need to have conversations about material reality and what's going on there. So I'm pointing to these things, these screens that are intermediating us, because that is a material reality that we're interacting with. We pretend it's not there. And so I'm saying, like, note this shit, man, because that's the first thing to disentangle from. I'm starting to think of just like a Just Say No campaign, but that's just too blunt. Maybe you're not aware of that. Was an anti-drug campaign by Ronald Reagan's wife, Nancy Reagan. Just Say No. It was actually very effective. But at some point, we're going to need to have a widespread change in social attitudes towards certain kinds of technology use. I think that could be coming as well. Yeah. So I think we're just scratching the surface here, actually.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zach. And I just want to say Godspeed to the effort that you're engaged in and that so many others are engaged in as well.
Yeah, man. Thank you. This was fun. Hopefully it useful to you guys. And I look forward to hearing more.
All right. Thank you, Zach.
Later, brother.